Everybody, if people could take their seats now, the session is starting. Thank you so much. Welcome back after lunch. We're halfway through day 3, but we're just getting started when we get this fantastic panel on Europe in front of us. The title of this panel is Fractured World Order, Where Does Europe Stand? And please give a huge round of applause and welcome back Europe Correspondent for Euronews, Shona Murray. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this really excellent panel for this afternoon. I'll just introduce our panel. We've got Bill Emmott, former editor-in-chief of The Economist and former chair of the IISS. We have Eoin Drea, senior researcher in the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies based in Brussels, Lisa O'Carroll, senior correspondent for The Guardian, and Ciarán Cuffe, co-chair of the European Green Party and former MEP. So thank you very much to our panel. So I think what we're going to do here is sort of divide into segments because we have so much to discuss when it comes to Europe and the fractured world. We'll start off maybe with trade because that's the EU's and Europe's greatest strength, and it's obviously one of our biggest vulnerabilities at the moment. And then all roads lead to Ukraine, and then we can talk about the Green Deal and the Middle East and also answer your questions. So we have a lot to get through, but I'm going to start with Bill, because Bill, you represent well, you describe yourself, I think, as a Brexit refugee. I mean, and you represent one of the biggest sort of events, momentous events that has happened in the European Union, for some time or ever. So maybe just tell us a little bit about your anecdote and your anecdote of your first time here in MacGill. Okay,
so yes, I think of myself as a Brexile. Why am I living in Ireland? Why did my wife and I decide to come and live here? Well, I actually was asked the same question by Shona O'Rourke on RTE, and I was delighted to be able to give a crowd-pleasing answer, which was because I wanted to live in a sane country. And Joe Mulholland heard that and invited me to MacGill. So therefore, this is my second time here, with great pleasure.
That's great. So look, let's start off with trade. We are awaiting the latest deadline from Donald Trump. What we know so far is the progress has been pretty much zero over the last few days. There is a threat for 15 to 20% tariffs against European Union countries. I mean, I might start with you, Eoin, on this, because you obviously work for the Wilfried Martens Centre, which is close to the EPP, and it's also, Germany, well, I suppose the greatest constituency is Germany within that organisation. Obviously, Ursula von der Leyen is German and so on. It's probably a good thing that Ireland and Germany are, if we're going to be vulnerable beside any country, Germany is probably the country we want to be vulnerable beside when it comes to trade. But what do you think could be the response here from the European Union? Does Germany want to retaliate?
Thank you, Shona, and it's great to be here in Donegal. Okay, well, I think the first thing you have to remember is that in Brussels, the EU views its trade policy as one of its crowning achievements. It's an EU competence. EU negotiates trade policy on behalf of the 27 member states. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that the EU is particularly ill-suited to confronting an approach like the current American approach under Trump, because traditionally the European approach has been very deliberative. They negotiate, they make sure to have agreement between all the 27 EU member states, goes to the Parliament, etc., etc. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing in Brussels is we're still seeing a lot of the old pre-Trump thinking, which is talking about, the benefits of multilateralism and how we should all still believe in the WTO and how the world is beautiful and we can influence, our standards on the rest of the world, which is fine. It's perfectly fine to believe that, but it's just not the political reality that's been confronted. And we've seen, I have to say, on this issue, I think the British government were very clever. They did a deal which, wasn't maybe a deal, but they got baseline 10%. And, negotiations will continue, and they're not left in the uncertainty that the Europeans are now left in. What I would say is that Europe isn't the only, traditional American ally that is confronting this uncertainty. Japan, a key US ally, is also confronting this. So last point, when it comes to the Germans, I think there are huge divisions in the European Union about how to respond to Trump. You would definitely have a camp led by the French, who would be much more robust and willing to retaliate. But the German economy hasn't grown in 3 years. It's facing shrinking demand, not just in Germany, but for German products in China. So it's caught between a declining US market and a declining Chinese market. So it's going to be very, very hard for the Germans to have, a significant retaliation against the US.
But Lisa, I mean, what Eoin was saying was that the UK did something very clever. They settled for 10% early on. But that's what the EU was doing. That was what they were willing to accept last Friday, 10% for stability and then carve-outs for various sectors. So it's not like the EU wasn't willing to do that. It's just that we know that there is a disregard from the Trump organisation or the Trump administration for the European Union. He says the EU is specifically set up to screw the United States. So it's not the same negotiation.
Well, there's definitely a different relationship between America and the UK and the US and Europe. He described once that Europe was even nastier than China when it comes to trade. He doesn't get that the EU doesn't like the idea of negotiating with somebody like Ursula von der Leyen doesn't speak Trump. She doesn't get to talk to him. It's a technocrat. Maroš Šefčovič is doing the negotiation. But just to come back to your point about the EU had already accepted there would be 10%. It didn't start like that. So back in April, I think it's really worth remembering that back in April when he threatened, I think it was 20% tariffs and claims that the EU were screwing him because they were charging 39% tariffs when in fact the average was 2.5 to 3. So if you remember, the language out of Brussels was very strong. To Ireland's detriment, there was even talk about tax on tech, then there was tax on aviation. The retaliatory package was going to be the bazooka, which is one of the European Commission's favourite words when they want to talk tough. But the reality is, and I think we heard this in the session on China yesterday, was that when you go through the filter of 27 capitals, that actually doesn't materialise. And about 3 weeks ago, I think the EU, there was something that absolutely critical to this conversation, happened, that we had the NATO summit in The Hague, and Europe, all I think it's 24 member states are in NATO, or 23. 23 needed to get Trump to stay on side on Ukraine because Europe doesn't have the defence capacity and won't be able to build defence capacity or build the equivalent of the American intelligence in the sky that directs those missiles and drones in Europe for possibly up to 10 years. So the big prize is that. And then it was very interesting last week before the Saturday announcement by Trump that tariffs were going up to 30%. The briefings in Europe were that it isn't that they've lost self-confidence and just now accepted that a UK-type bare-bones deal is acceptable as opposed to this big comprehensive deal. It was that what the Commission were trying to do was find a balance between the short-term pain, which is tariffs, and in Ireland's case that would be quite significant. Ireland, Germany and Italy are the only three countries with a surplus with the States. So it was that short-term pain in tariffs for the term that Trump is in power, and the long-term pain, which would be a Russia invading Europe. So I think that's very interesting. And the other point, just very briefly, it's very interesting to see that Germany is back in the driving seat. Yeah. Olaf Scholz was almost off the pitch for his entire premiership. And Merz has been extremely strong and is voicing the car industry's concerns. And it was he, 2 weeks ago, that talked about, we want a quick deal. He has a direct line to Trump. The auto industry has a direct line to Trump. So I think that's interesting to see that Germany, more than France, where Macron is on his final lap, is possibly driving the policy.
Very true. Very true. I mean, Bill. So, what's your own perspective? What do you think you'd like to see the European Union do now? Given that, 15 to 20% is going to be extremely difficult to absorb.
Well, I think the first thing I'd like the European Union to do is to play for time, partly for the reasons that Lisa has said, which is that the war in Ukraine is the more urgent and critical issue. And the summer offensive, the summer battles are where Ukraine can be won or lost this year. Trump has made a reversal on allowing US weapons to go to Ukraine, but they're going to be paid for by European countries. Those weapons are going to take time to get to Ukraine anyway, but also we don't want a falling out with the US during the time when we're trying to get weapons to Ukraine urgently to really protect civilians and protect Ukraine against that. Then, once we get towards the winter, that will become less critical and maybe the things will shift back. So I'd say one, play for time, which means, and Trump's deadlines are extremely flexible. He said 30% last weekend, now he says 15 to 20%. He said August the 1st, he said all of these different dates. His Treasury Secretary says September the 1st. I think he can be played for time. So that's the one thing I'd like to do. Second, I think a key point to add about the UK is that the reason the UK went for the 10% is because goods exports are not very important to the UK, which is not a manufacturing superpower anymore. It's services that matter to the UK. And there wasn't a big cost to the UK in agreeing to that deal. For the EU, services are the weapon to use back on the US. And the question to me is when, in this process, hopefully of playing for time, the EU uses services, which is where the EU has a big deficit with the US, where it imports an enormous amount of particularly tech services, but other services as well. That's where the tech tax, the issues of regulation and so forth can come into play. And the truth is that the EU does not have a big surplus with the US overall. It has a big goods surplus, but a big services deficit. So there's a battle to be had. The EU question is when to have that battle.
Do you think that we'll have the choice? That's the thing, is it? I mean, you're saying play for time, but we're not. It's not an equal partnership.
Well, it's not an equal partnership in the sense that Trump decides what Trump does.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's an equal partnership in the sense that this is a 1.4 trillion euro trading relationship, which matters hugely to both sides. So let's not flagellate ourselves as Europeans. We have weapons in this. We matter to American businesses. We matter. So we can get pressure on the White House, rather as Lisa was saying about the car industry, lobbying with the White House, so the tech industry lobbies. We can get them to put some pressure on, which can then discourage the White House from rushing to a decision, committing itself. Wall Street can pressure and say, come on, let's go slow on this. So I think there's a risk with Europe on this that we self-flagellate too much.
Do you think that's what Europe is doing, Ciarán? Do you think that they haven't shown, or the EU hasn't shown enough strength, that someone like Donald Trump, a bit like Putin, only responds positively to strength?
I think he does respond to power. Do you remember that note Mark Rutte, former Dutch Prime Minister, sent to NATO? Are people familiar with the note that was leaked by the Trump administration that was sent by Mark Rutte to Trump? It was a sycophantic note of, you're doing a great job and I want to work with you. I can't currently see Ursula von der Leyen doing something similar.
No, she won't. And I know for a fact she's refused that, yeah.
And actually, I think you have to play him at his own game. I think you have to do that all-caps messaging, show you are strong, to kind of work at him using the way that he operates. But I think what is really important, the important card that Europe has, is stability. Because we have to negotiate with 27 member states, we actually are very focused and very careful in what we say and when we say it. And I think in a world gone mad, the stability that Europe offers is crucial to stay the course. And as Bill points out, we don't have to do this today, tomorrow or the next day. And of course, Europe goes on holidays for the next month and a half. But I think we can give ourselves time, but I think Europe does have to stand strong, and it does have to adopt, and the European Commission and President von der Leyen has to adopt a bit of that mad way of messaging that Trump uses.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see it from Ursula von der Leyen, but just shaking the head there. Go on. What are you shaking your head?
Well, yeah, like I actually agree with Ciarán that that's what they should do,
Yeah.
but I just can't imagine a German conservative president of the European Commission who has one ear back in the Chancellery in Berlin doing anything that will endanger the interests of German industry, and that's just the reality of politics in Europe.
When you see what Trump is doing, though, I mean, so he's saying to European countries they have to increase from 2% to 5% spending on GDP on weapons, on defence, not just weapons, and at the same time imposing really punitive tariff rates. What do you think that this is really just him setting Europe up to fail in some way? Because, you know, over the next few years, the US will say that they want to see in budgets in European countries the expenditure every year to make it up to 5% over the next 10 years, and then imposing these tariffs, putting a lot more pressure on European economies.
Well, I think, you know, sometimes we tend to view what's going on with the United States and we think that it just started with Trump. But there's been an element of American foreign policy, certainly back to Reagan in the 1980s, when the Cold War was in the last decade, which was essentially the message to a lot of US allies was, you're either with us or against us. So the US thinking is that, you know, no matter how we screw you, you're still better off sticking with us than, you know, going to China. And it's a very aggressive, it's a very, you know, functional kind of foreign policy narrative. But certainly that seems to be in the ascendancy in Washington at the moment. And however, you know, bad we think that Trump is treating Europe, how he is treating the Japanese and the South Koreans, he's two key security partners in the Indo-Pacific to contain China, is absolutely unbelievable.
Bill?
I was only going to add, I think I agree entirely with what's been said. I would add that we should remember that the real reason why Europe is spending more on defence, and was already spending a lot more on defence before Donald Trump was re-elected, is Vladimir Putin. Russia is the reason we're spending more on defence. Now, accepting somewhat meaningless targets of 3.5 plus 1.5 for 2035 is all about political pressure, and which is the NATO agreement. Understand that if you can. That is to do with the hot air and the pressure of, you know, from American foreign policy. But why is Poland spending 5% already on
and
defense?
Estonia and Lithuania
And everyone. Yeah. Why has Finland and Sweden joined NATO and so forth? It's Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that's right.
I think Europe has an opportunity in this as well. The first thing I want to say is the concerns about defence, the real visceral fear of Putin, is almost impossible to understand in Western Europe in an Irish audience. But when I sit down with my Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian colleagues, they are really worried that Putin will come across the border. I mean, the kind of debates in the Baltic statelets is whether or not to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention on landmines. Why? Because these countries want to have a belt of landmines ready if Putin comes across the border. So we can have an esoteric discussion of the triple lock or all kinds of things, but in those countries, it's what might happen tomorrow or the next day. And I was in Tallinn a couple of years ago, and the discussion was, well, in 24 hours, how many troops can we mobilize? The agreement with Poland and Estonia, does that mean we can have 5,000 troops or 1,500 troops ready within 6 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours? It's a debate we're not even thinking about here. We're still wrestling with the Commission of Defence Forces that said our army, our defence forces are 40 years out of date. So I think we have to come to grips with that. But the second point I just want to make very briefly is that when it comes to spending on defence, we can have all kind of interesting discussions as to what constitutes defence. And Niinisto, the former Finnish Prime Minister, has a brilliant report on security, defence and resilience. And he interprets security and resilience as not just being arms and guns. It's about security, energy security, civic resilience. Are we ready for extreme weather events? And remembering that what has really killed Europe in the last 5-10 years has been wildfires, it's been floods, and the biggest army call-outs in the EU have been to do with extreme weather. So spending money on preparing for climate-related events, spending money on energy security can be part of that spend. So it's not just about the guns and ammo. And I think Europe is good at the selective interpretation as to what constitutes defence.
Just before I move on to the Ukraine piece, Lisa, I just want to ask you what you know, from obviously reporting in Brussels the whole time, what do you think the EU will do? Do you think it's likely the EU will have to retaliate against the United States on tariffs if it's anything more than, say, 10%?
Well, I just think over the last month, before that NATO summit and after, that we saw the power and the playbook, rather, being drained away from the Commission to the capitals. So it was Germany that led against France, led those states that we have got to go for a quick deal. We need to get Trump out of our hair. We absolutely need to do a UK-style deal. Whereas the Commission, very senior people in the Commission were going, we'll never do that deal. That UK deal is legally unimplementable, etc., etc. Now, the UK deal is a pretty bad deal. It's based on autos, steel, aerospace parts, and then sell their own ethanol industry down the Swanee, and there is a bit that both sides can trade on beef. That's all it is. It is an absolute bare-bones deal. So what I'm interested to see is whether, you know, when Sefcovic comes back, and the briefings yesterday were, as you said, that there's no progress that has been made, and the FT reported this morning or overnight that what the Europeans were looking, the US were looking for was tariffs at around 50 to 20% would be an absolute killer to EU trade. So just to finish the point is go back to an MEP in Strasbourg the week before last, an Italian MEP, Brando Benefi, who was very instrumental in the AI Act. He was now on the Trade Committee, and he was saying, we will fight if Europe accepts a 10% tariff. This is before the tariff 30% went up to 30%. We will fight it because it will make Europe look weak, we will be the victims, and we will be paralysed. And he turned out to be correct. He said, if we accept 10%, Trump would just come back for more.
Yeah. So
what I would be interested to see is whether Sefcovic remains the interlocutor that he is, or whether the power now goes to the Frances and the Germanys in terms of deciding whether we retaliate or not.
Yeah, and those two aren't on the same page as that anyway. So, Bill, one thing you said earlier I wanted to ask you about was that you said this summer offensive in Ukraine is, I mean, you didn't say make or break, but it's pretty crucial.
Yeah, no, it's the fourth summer of the war, let's remember that. Ukraine is incredibly holding its ground, but it's losing like small amounts of territory. I think what it's a make or break for is Putin's calculation about this war. To me, ever since the first 18 months of the war or so, the real task that the Europeans and the Americans should have been focusing on is how to convince Putin that he's failed. How to change his calculation into making him look for a way to retreat or to end the war with some sort of claimed success. But
an off-ramp.
An off-ramp. And I think that this summer is quite critical for convincing him, or for him becoming convinced that actually carrying on is not useful and not productive for Russia. Now, obviously there are many questions about how Russia works and what a war machine it is and how anyone but Putin makes any decisions. So it's complicated, but the less well he does during this summer, the more he could be convincible this autumn that actually drawing a line now is where he should be. And that's why I think the Europeans really do need to get, even at the risk of their own stocks, send them to Ukraine, get them there. I would really like Friedrich Merz to be able to send long-range missiles, Taurus missiles. That seems to be difficult with his coalition partners.
Yeah, what is the story with that, Eoin? Because that's something he promised throughout the election. Obviously, he went into coalition, but it looked like that might materialise.
Yeah, well, I think if Merz was governing on his own, I think
the
missiles would already be in the missiles would already be in Ukraine. The problem is his coalition partners, the Social Democrats. There's a significant proportion of that party, maybe 40 to 45%, who would gladly, force Ukraine to have a truce tomorrow and open Russia back up for German businesses. And this is a long-standing tradition in German social democracy. The former German Prime Minister Gerhard Schroeder, we all know about his connections to Russian business. But I always get kind of anxious talking about Ukraine in Ireland, because I really want Irish people to know that in Brussels, Ireland is not viewed as a credible voice, as a serious voice on security and defence in Europe. And I think that's very important. So we can have these long, very impassioned discussions here about Irish neutrality and the triple lock. But really, and I'm sure now there'll be, government officials here who will talk about all the new equipment we're going to buy. But then I talk to my friends in the defence forces. And Ireland is buying a towed sonar array so we can, know if the Russian submarines are interfering with our cables. On some days we don't have enough sailors even to put a ship to sea. So what are we going to tow the sonar array with? And I think our European partners, to be honest, there was a lot of ignorance about the Irish situation before Ukraine. We were out on the western seaboard, didn't really matter, But essentially now I think it's become very clear in Brussels is that, Britain takes care of our security and defence for free. If there's a Russian fighter that buzzes by Irish airspace, it's RAF jets that are scrambled to meet them. We don't have any jets, so it couldn't be us. So I think, when we talk about Ukraine, of course, definitely I agree with Bill, but I think, maybe if we were to act a little bit more, maybe we might have a more serious, credible debate on it.
But what would you think then Ireland could do right now?
Well, Ireland can't do right now because I think, was it Ciarán or Bill said we're 40 years behind. So we have nothing to add. And talking about how amazing we were taking in so many Ukrainian refugees is fine, but that will only get you so far. And that that will not help Ukraine win on the battlefield. I would argue if we had, a couple of dozen missiles that we could have sent them in March 2022, that would have been a lot more, useful for them.
There's very simple steps. We need to know what's in the air above us and what's in the sea underneath us. And that's what the Commission says. So we have to invest in radar. We have to invest in technology that allows us to know what's going on underneath. We are, thankfully, moving into further PESCO tasks, which is essentially cooperation with our European partners on being able to look at things like underwater infrastructure, but also look at cybersecurity. The Commission said we need 200 Defence Forces personnel working on cybersecurity. At the time the report was written 3 years ago, we had none. And we all know hybrid warfare is what is actively happening, whether it be on X or in other media formats. We have to be ready for that, and we have to have people who are working on that. So there are very simple tasks. Obviously, paying our defence forces a decent wage so we can put more than one ship to sea at any point in time. This is basic stuff. Before we think about fighter jets or all the fancy stuff, let's find out what's going on up there, down there, and let's start thinking about cyber warfare.
You go on. You go on, you can.
Sorry, Lisa. And I just want to make clear that there is a difference between being neutral and being defenceless. It's a perfectly...
Well, Finland used to not be in NATO and is one of the most defended countries in the world.
Austria is neutral and is going to spend 2% of GDP on defence. So really this isn't an issue about neutrality. It's an issue about being able, as Ciarán said, to defend what's going on in the sky and below us. So sometimes in Ireland I find that the debate automatically goes to neutrality, and then it goes in all sorts of different directions. But actually it's not about neutrality at all.
Lisa, we are in it for the long haul, though, this war in Ukraine, because I know, Bill, you were saying that it could be make or break this summer, but if you look at what the United States has done regarding Vladimir Putin, Putin just basically feels I can get away with anything here. I mean, there's no pressure. There was no there was no tariffs on Russia. I think Putin's been given 50 days. Then they stopped. They wouldn't give the Patriot system to Ukraine. Now they are. They stopped intelligence for a while. They obviously humiliated Zelensky. I know things slightly seem to be warming up a little bit, but not in any sufficient way that would see the United States actually on the side of Ukraine.
No, I think you're right, and I think Putin has shown time and time again since April, hasn't he, that he's laughing in Trump's face. He's had the phone calls, he's had the warnings, he's had the flattery, and he continues to, I think one of the journalists from Ukraine in Brussels was saying that Kyiv has never felt more under attack than it has before. And I had a very interesting conversation with somebody quite close to the front row here the other night over dinner who was saying actually the opposite to you, Bill, which was rather than give Putin the off-ramp, maybe what we need is, or maybe what the States needs to get its act together, Trump to be persuaded that he needs to be tougher, is to humiliate Trump even more.
Putin even more.
For Putin to humiliate Trump, make him really mad with his bullshit, etc., etc. But on just on the defence, if I could come in on that, on this point of cybersecurity, I think it's really interesting to talk about that. Since Ukraine was invaded, we've had a pattern of sabotage, physical sabotage, fires. We've had things like coffins under the Eiffel Tower.
There's the attempted assassination of the head of the German weapons company, Rheinmetall, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There's been various assassination attempts, cyber attacks, even on our own HSC there was a major cyber attack.
Anti-Semitism that has been sourced back to Russia.
Russian bots.
So we're talking about the hybrid warfare attack, which is all about not so much killing people, but it's killing democratic systems, and it's trying to undermine the credibility of elected governments, to create distrust among people. So it ranges from misinformation during elections. In Spain, for instance, they found that researchers found that there were kind of sleepers that were set up on the Telegram channel who would be following a Kremlin account on Telegram, and then they would be activated coming up to an election, but they at this stage would already have an organic audience in Spain, which would make them a credible source to say there's a bomb alert down at your polling station, so don't vote. And then one other thing, I was just looking before I came up this morning at something that we wrote about 2 months ago, and it was a really fascinating investigation led by the Germans, and it was called Operation Endgame, and it was about cybersecurity. And there were, on the Europol side, they announced that they were looking for something like 18 people. They were all Russia-based, but at the same time, overnight, a document was unsealed in California, which I looked at it again this morning, and the indictment started in 2015, and it just exposed at a quite top level how sophisticated ransomware attacks are. So there are a number of operatives in the States. They reckon they've made 50 million, and they had set up, it just showed you the modus operandi of ransomware attacks. They start the malware, stick something onto your computer, take the data, and then blackmail you. But what these had done, they set up, was almost like a criminal social media system where you subscribe $3,000 to $5,000 to be part of this unit. And then you can go in, they had 2 layers. They had commercial, so you could do a ransomware attack on The Guardian has been subject to a ransomware attack, HSE, Marks & Spencer, whoever. And then they had an espionage one. Very, very sophisticated, all the servers in Russia. So, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about that, what was interesting was Amazon, Google, all the big companies had been involved in the investigation in the States. And I wonder, to go back to Mark Little's point about 200 people knowing the algorithms that run the world, basically, whether we need to harness the information and the resource and intellectual capacity of those private companies to help us with the cyber resilience.
Well, I think that's what they do in Finland, isn't it? It's a fully comprehensive. So it's the private sector, the public sector, the army, NGOs, and so on. So it's all collective. Did anyone want to ask a question at this point?
While you're choosing questions, can I just clarify one quick thing, which is that I don't want to give Putin an off-ramp.
Yeah.
I want him to drive down it.
So go
in
on.
In other words, I think he's always. Well, just to clarify, because I think I wasn't very clear.
Yeah.
I didn't express myself very well, but I don't want to interrupt the questions. But I think the key thing with Putin, he's always had off-ramps.
That's the thing. At the very start, there was off-ramps everywhere.
Yeah, we don't have to give him one. He's got damn off-ramps.
Yeah.
It's just he won't drive down it.
But what would you think would actually be the tipping point for him to go down an off-ramp?
Well, I do. Obviously, I think a serious threat of substantial amounts of U.S. weapons being supplied, and substantial amounts of long-range German weapons, Taurus and other weapons. So a shift back in the balance of power militarily between Ukraine and Russia that just makes it look hopeless.
That doesn't look likely at all now, does it, Bill? At this moment,
it doesn't look very likely at this point. No, it doesn't. That would be a big thing. The second thing would be a sense that actually he got as far as he's ever going to get.
Which I think there is a sense of that, because
he's
it's not moving any further.
He's hardly moving.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians are strong in their defense now. They're very innovative in their defense. So maybe it's part of that, convincing that is as far as you can damn well go, so you better sue for peace. Which then, maybe the psycho war between Trump and Putin could be used in that. Humiliate Trump and make him...
When we look back at this moment, before we go to Question Zone, and we have opportunities like this, like Bill just outlined, and we're not taking them by maybe ending the war, by delivering Ukraine what it needs at this moment in time, will we ever forgive ourselves, basically? Or Europe?
Well, yeah, and I think it's a good example of how, in Brussels, actually, weirdly, Ukraine is viewed as a success for EU cohesion. Because, broadly speaking, the EU still remains united on supporting Ukraine. But I think Europe does have to do more to give Ukraine a path to EU membership, even while the war is going on. Because it's very important that we don't repeat the mistakes of the Western Balkans in Ukraine. If you go to countries, I was recently in North Macedonia, Albania, you've got young people there who are losing hope of EU accession because they've been, 20, 30 years in the waiting room. And we're talking very small countries, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people. So if the EU can't even do that right, there's huge potential for backsliding on Ukraine, particularly if the fighting were to stop. And I think we should be very, very aware of that.
Okay. That gentleman there, and can't we see that lady there? I think is the name. There, the hat. If you can keep them just short, that would be great. Thanks.
I will. Joe Musgrave. So, in thinking about the future for Europe, one of the lessons is America is the indispensable but unreliable partner. And then going forward, what's our response? Is it Europe energizing itself through the Draghi report? Is it some other method? Basically, what is Europe's response to stop itself from fracturing in a fractured world?
That's a good question.
Ciarán wants to...
Go on, Ciarán.
I think it's all about social cohesion. And I think in a world gone mad, Europe actually does social cohesion quite well. Generally speaking, within the EU member states, we do have fairly strong safety nets on health and education. That's something that has been lost in the United States and increasingly in the UK, where the top 30%, the bottom 30% are often in real poverty in the UK and in the US. In Europe, in the EU, it's closer to 10%. I think when it comes to the unique selling point of Europe, I think it is social cohesion, but it's also the green transition. And if we look at the different power blocks around the world, Russia is a petrostate. The US is quite a bit of a petrostate. It also does tech. China is moving from huge coal dependency towards renewables. Europe does complexity and the green transition quite well. And I know there's a lot of talk about, the European Green Deal is gone. It's not. It's been rebranded. It's now the Clean Industrial Deal. But the over 20 pieces of legislation that we passed on decarbonisation over the last 5 years, they're still there. They're slightly watered down, but they are having an impact. They are cleaning the air in Europe. They are providing well-paid green jobs. and they are tackling climate change. And for me, that is where Europe needs to be over the next decade.
I'm going to go back to the Green Deal with Eoin and you later, because the EPP has been overnagging on that quite a bit. Who's next? That gentleman there, and then there was a girl over there, thanks.
We mustn't forget the lessons of the Second World War. Russia moved all its industrial production to the east of the Urals. You know, all they have to do to avoid the use of longer range missiles is simply to move their production east of the Urals, and that makes it easier for China and North Korea to resupply them, and that's what's happening. They are being resupplied. So you will never defeat Russia militarily.
So what do you say then should happen exactly to stop Putin from, invading and killing Ukrainians?
Well, we need to use sanctions against China, because Putin can't get the chips that he needs from the Western world. He's turned to China, and they're supplying him with the chips that are needed for his drones, his missiles, and he continues to hammer Ukraine's civilian population with all of those munitions. So we need to look towards China through the east.
Can I come back?
Yeah, go on.
May I?
Just very briefly, I think that's interesting, but the EU can't even act tough with China on your electric vehicles and Shein and Temu and all the rest. So I cannot see that the EU is going to sanction China. I just can't.
I'd just like to respectfully disagree with the proposition that Russia can't be defeated militarily. I just think that I see no real evidence for that, apart from obviously he's willing to throw millions of Russian men into the meat grinder and so forth. He's got people that he's willing to use, but I think Russia is more vulnerable to pressure, more vulnerable to social discord, more vulnerable to discontent, even among the ex-KGB billionaires that are all around him. I think that they can be hit back, and I think that Ukraine has shown when it has used long-range attacks that it can be pretty effective. Now, okay, if you were talking a 20-year war, then your point about moving production would have some sense. But I think that he is defeatable. And I think we should continue to attempt to defeat him.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the question here at the front, which I thought kind of hit the nail on the head. Is I think in Europe you will see what you're seeing now is a refocusing on what the basic principles of the EU were in the very beginning, which is generating wealth through better integration of the single market. I think the single market, everything that Draghi has said, that's going to be a real focus. And also it's going to be a focus about a more realistic implementation of the road to decarbonisation. So, yeah, that's...
That lady there and then this gentleman.
Afternoon, and forgive me, I'm no military scholar, but I have a question about it, so I'm going to disagree entirely with with the last gentleman to ask a question. So when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2022, I remember seeing graphics illustrating how much more vast the Russian military was than Ukraine's, the multiples of men that they had, the multiples of tanks, of missiles, of general might. And I remember Simon Coveney saying, God help the Ukrainians on the night of the invasion. It was actually the evening before my birthday, I remember it very well. And everyone expected that it would be basically Poland in 1939. And we're 3 weeks later, and the term meat grinder is very apt, but it's not solely or even maybe primarily a meat grinder for Ukrainians, it's a meat grinder for the Russians. And it's not only in Russia that we're seeing it, also Israel is conscripting its Orthodox, its Haredim, and I don't think they're conscripting them because they're renowned fighters either. And they are fighting against not even an army, a ragtag band of young men in an enclave that has been turned into rubble, where there is absolutely no food, and 85% of the population is apparently now in the 5th stage of malnutrition. And in concordance with those two scenarios, this past summer, we also had a couple of incredibly short wars which were resolved in fairly unique ways. I'm thinking of the war between Israel and Iran, which was everyone thought that it would turn into World War III when the US dropped a bomb on the Iranian nuclear site, but then it came out that the nuclear site had been emptied out weeks earlier, and that the Iranian counterstrike on America had been actually discussed with the American government beforehand. So, to sum up, are we in an era where where war as it was fought in the 20th century, where we presumed it would be fought, actually no longer exists, and these things that we call forever wars are actually kind of the failure of what we thought would win wars, the big tech, the big missiles, and the millions of men to work, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. It is an interesting point. I mean, from the European perspective, the support really for Israel at a time when Ireland and Spain and a couple of other countries have the opposing view.
Yeah, and it's certainly an issue that takes up a lot of my time as co-chair of the European Green Party, because I think the legacy of the Holocaust casts a very long shadow over Central Europe. And when I talk to my colleagues from Germany, from Austria, they are so hardwired into protecting the state of Israel, they find it incredibly difficult to recognize the magnitude of human slaughter of the Palestinian people that is occurring. However, public opinion is changing in Germany, and the views of my German colleagues are also changing. Within recent weeks, we, the European Green Party, have come out with all our member parties in favour of suspending the EU-Israel association agreement and using the parts of it that don't require unanimity. So views are changing, but I was going to say, just as part of the bigger picture, I think Europe is quite united, but I think the views on Ukraine, and more specifically the views on the Middle East, are absolutely causing huge divisions within the EU member states.
Can I chip in quickly on this? I think that principally, and obviously not wholly, but principally, EU policy towards Israel needs to be seen as essentially an EU policy towards Washington. The reason, the EU feels, one, that it doesn't have much influence over what goes on in Israel, so therefore making gestures about trade, and I'm afraid about the Occupied Territories Bill and so forth, as it were, wouldn't achieve the big goals that they have, and they're divided over it. But secondly, the basic aim of EU governments has been to keep the US involved in Ukraine and things like that. And they don't want to get into a confrontation with the US over an issue like Israel-Palestine, over which they can't make much difference, and as the cost of that, lose Ukraine and endanger European security. So this is not to take any moral view of it, but I think in pragmatic terms, that's what we're seeing. Yeah,
that's for sure now under Donald Trump, but under Joe Biden, they could have had that discussion around what was happening in Gaza at the same time. This has been going on for 2 years. And Owen, if you look at the EU policy when it comes to the Palestinian territories or Palestine, starvation, children dying, trying to get water, flour, just the most horrendous scenes ever. And the EU saying they want to see Putin in the International Criminal Court, rightfully so. But then you have Friedrich Merz saying, I'll invite Netanyahu to Berlin, and Ursula von der Leyen tweeting, I just spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu, we just got off the phone, we stand with Israel in relation to Iran and Israel, but as him as a legitimate actor, when the EU's very specific, arena is international law and values.
Yeah, well, sometimes I think in Ireland when we talk about Palestine, I think we think that we are the only country that has a specific, historical association. And I think Ciarán said very well about how the Germans and the Austrians come at this from a very angle. But what I constantly get asked in Brussels is, Ireland is a very small member state. So we have a limited amount of political capital that we can use to get things on the agenda or get decisions made, for our priorities in Brussels. And I'm constantly asked is, why are we expending so much of that capital on the Palestinian issue, given our, we're not so involved in, the tens of thousands of children that Putin has, Ukrainian kids that Putin has kidnapped and shipped back to Russia, given, that we can't even protect our own, air and waters, air and sea. In Europe, it's perceived as being quite a symbolic gesture by Ireland. And when I was driving up from Dublin yesterday, there was this very long debate on the radio show, and it was, I don't know who it was on, but it was all about how, the Occupied Territories Bill is very important, symbolism, about Ireland. But that's to make us feel better. That's not
because
going
it won't make any difference on the ground or shift Israeli policy.
And we have to be aware, and again, this isn't a judgment about whether it's right or whether it's wrong.
Yeah.
As a state, we are hugely economically dependent on the United States. If US investment declines in Ireland, that's the end of bumper corporate tax rates. That's a huge budget deficit. That's, cutting health spending. That's cutting education spending. So somehow in our political muddle, we've confused what Ireland's interests are with what our principles are.
But I mean, the question I asked you, though, was specifically in relation to the double standards of the European Union. Wasn't really, I mean, I understand the point about proportionality and the Occupied Territories Bill. That is a very important discussion to be had around that. But specifically Europe and European values and the double standards and the credibility of Europe with the global south and across the world. That's the question.
Yeah, but this is, this isn't, the EU does not, the EU can talk about principles, it can talk about values. But at the end of the day, this is politics. And this is hard-nosed politics, and it's as Bill alluded to. The Spanish, I see sometimes, it's really funny, for me it's funny, the Spanish are sometimes alluded to as big supporters of Ireland in, recognising Palestine, etc. Up to a couple of months ago, the Spanish were spending billions of euros on Israeli military equipment. And suddenly we've got an embattled Prime Minister in Sanchez who suddenly turns to the Palestinian issue as one of his great causes. So, all politics is dirty, as I say to people. All politics is a compromise. And if we sit above this on our high principles, then we're really not going to do anything. We might make ourselves feel better, but trust me, our credibility in Brussels is already low enough on a host of other issues.
Ooh la la. What other issues are you in trouble over?
Well, I think. I think number one, and this is representative of the response of the Irish officials in Brussels, is in Brussels we are perceived as being in the pocket of the US tech companies, particularly the social media companies, and we are viewed as not applying the EU rules properly, particularly on data protection. And let me just say this. Things are so bad that what's basically happened is that the Irish data protection regulator is not viewed as credible in Brussels anymore. So what happens every time there is a decision from the Irish data protection regulator is that all the other data regulators from around Europe have set up their own little group to analyse the Irish decisions, and most of them end up getting appealed or they implement pressure on the Irish.
So we're undermined, and we've undermined ourselves, or we're not credible in that regard.
Yeah, and this goes right back to when the data protection was set up, the Irish Data Protection Commissioner was set up, and it was located above a Centra shop in Port Arlington.
Okay.
Yeah, that is.
Okay, just going to go here, because I don't want to get too bogged down in Ireland. And,
Thanks. John McGuane, sticking with dirty politics and the point that we haven't hope in hell of defending our own waters, let alone Europe's northwestern flank. What would it take for us to do a deal, the obvious bleeding deal, with our nearest neighbour and oldest enemy, and just pay for defence and get on with that, get it off the page, and then get taken seriously with our European neighbours?
Well, that's. I haven't heard it discussed, but that's the obvious solution. And we had a panel here about a united, talking about a united Ireland. Obviously, a united Ireland that would have combined British Isles defence capacity is the obvious, but whether we're ready for that.
I'll ask Thomas Byrne in the next section. That's
Yeah, no,
specifically in the next section.
you're got, and make sure you to ask him about the 5 things that we're doing wrong in Brussels as well.
Sorry, Majella OD. Just turning to Tim, and if the occupational territories is not the way to go, what is a solution? Because, you know, it's something that takes up a lot of our mind space in Ireland. 800 years of oppression, famine, deprivation, starvation. What can we actually do to make a change to that?
Ciarán, do you want to take that?
Yeah, look, I think the passage of legislation is an important element of the pull-down menu of what we can do in the Middle East. We do have this long and honourable tradition of peacekeeping as a non-aligned / neutral nation. I think it is. I would agree with Eoin that we don't want to put all our eggs in the one basket on this, and I think it is important that we talk about all of the human rights and injustices that are happening in Yemen, in Congo, in other parts, Sudan, and around the world. So I think we have to be careful not to be completely focused on the Middle East. But I mean, the Middle East, what's happening in Palestine, we just have so much footage of it happening in real time. I think as a post-colonial nation, we do find it so strong and so close to our own history. So we have to act on that. But there are other, we need to use as much soft diplomacy as well as legislation on trade.
Okay, who's next? Then just down there, the gentleman with glasses, and there.
Thanks very much. My name is Eoin Kennedy. Just to go back to the theme of this panel, does the panel feel that the requirement for unanimity in decision making is de facto causing fracture?
That's a very good question.
Yes, I think it is, and I think we'll have to move towards qualified majority voting in a much broader range of issues, and that will imply some trade-offs for Ireland, be it corporate tax or whatever. But I think for the EU to function 100%.
Okay.
I would definitely agree. I think that the mood is in that direction. It's a question of how you get there. But 27 countries destined to be larger. There's no way to run this show without that.
But the impact then, you're talking, you made the point earlier about the very German EU, and then you've got Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. You know, Germany really is the deciding vote in every case. Ireland, with a small population, we would really lose any influence that we had if we were to go through qualified majority voting and not unanimity at the Council.
I agree, absolutely. But I presume what qualified majority would achieve would be perhaps a quicker, more fleet-of-foot EU that would be able to move without the drag of Hungary and Slovakia at the moment. I mean, maybe you could ask the question whether Ireland, in terms of the Middle East, could be the Orban.
Well, we're not, though. I mean, we don't behave. We don't abuse our veto.
But we do have to reform it because there are many member states in a line wishing to. There are many countries that are in a line to join the EU. I was in Montenegro 2 weeks ago. The thirst for membership of the EU is palpable. Why? Because the EU stands for democracy. It stands for rule of law, which is almost impossible to describe to people. What is rule of law? It means when you have a law, you enforce it. Now, I know we laugh about enforcement of laws in Ireland, but go to the Western Balkans and see what it means about laws not being enforced, about the appointment of the judiciary, about state contracts not going to one preferred firm. This is what rule of law means, and this is why people in the Western Balkans want to be part of a stronger European Union. So because the EU is going to expand, Montenegro possibly by the end of the decade, perhaps Albania as well, they want to be part of the club, and if the club moves towards 40 members, there has to be significant reforms. Also, I would say, it's not just about Ireland losing influence. Ireland always has to work with other countries. As an MEP, I sat down once a month with my Nordic colleagues for a breakfast with colleagues from Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands and Ireland. Why? Because we had a lot of common cause, and in EU, in a green group that was often quite dominated by the Germans or the French, we often had different views coming from the Nordic corner perspective. Ireland does that already, so I don't think we are completely sort of ruled out of the game by giving up the unanimity.
That gentleman there at the back.
Alex Piggott. I'd like to disagree with the view that Russia can be beaten. Napoleon and Hitler tried, and they failed miserably. And I think we've seen...
That doesn't mean that that's always true. Russia has lost conflicts.
It maybe lost conflicts. It hasn't been beaten, in a war. The point I'm making is that in terms of Ukraine...
The Japanese beat Russia. 1905.
Yeah.
War.
They didn't get to Moscow. Okay.
They didn't want to get to Moscow.
Okay. Fine. That's fine. So what I'm trying to say is you try and move into somebody's country and you can be sure as eggs that the people of the country are going to they will rally to the cause more than ever before in terms of once they're in their own country. Look at what the Palestinians are doing and how bravely they're trying to fight back, what the Ukrainians are doing in terms of trying to fight back. The panel has said that the future that you've given us, is that our children and grandchildren will be going to war at some time in the future. That is what the future you're giving to us.
I think it's the opposite, though, is it not? To stop Russia now so those grandchildren don't go to war, is that it?
I'm going to try and get to my question, if you don't mind. Yeah. What currently is happening is that the United States is very cleverly saying, guys, we're going to sell you the weapons, and we're going to stand back and watch as Europe implodes. In terms of, and that's one market that they're going to get rid of as well. They actually chase after the Chinese. So what we're doing is we're ruining ourselves. Is that what we really want? All conflicts end in some sort of dialogue. Is there nobody in Brussels who's talking to the Russians to try and finish this war so that our grandchildren don't end up...
spent 3 hours on the phone to Vladimir Putin 2 weeks ago.
It's the only phone call that he's had with Putin since 2022, and nobody else has phoned Putin out of the whole of the European leaders. He's the only one.
Go on, Bill.
There you go. Is there anybody talking to Putin besides Macron for 2 hours in 3.5 years? Thank you.
Is Putin taking phone calls? Is Putin responding in any way that makes those phone calls worthwhile? That's a key question. But, I mean, on the general concern that you have, does rearmament mean that we want war? Absolutely not. It means we want to prevent war. We absolutely need to have a proper defense, in my view, in order to make war much less likely. That's why Estonia is doing what it's doing. It's why Poland is doing what it's doing. It's to stop war. We do not want our young people to die in wars. The key issue for Europe is, of course, building its economic strength, because that is what provides the finances to do all of these things, to pay for weapons, to pay for armed forces, but also to make Europe a vibrant place that people feel attracted to rather than contemptuous of. And some of the reality about Russia at the moment is that Russia is contemptuous of European leaders, considers them weak and indecisive, and that's why he's only been willing to speak to the Americans, although I think in the case of Trump, he's only speaking to Trump because he thinks he can manipulate Trump, and the question is whether that will be played out in the future. I'm happy for anyone to go and talk to Putin. What really needs to happen is for Putin to be persuadable and to persuade himself that actually his claim, his conditions which he's putting down for any serious talks are absolutely unfeasible and unrealistic and are tantamount to saying, don't bother to call. So you need to persuade Putin to take a more pragmatic method or attitude to ending the war. At the moment, he's claiming all of the things he continued to claim 3.5 years ago.
Okay, just going to wrap up here. Ciarán, just a quick question to wrap up. Are you concerned about the EPP's sort of dilution of the Green Deal? We have Eoin here to respond to you if you need. But I'm not trying to start a fight. Voting down the nature restoration law.
Look, I am, and there is a long list of the opposition to the nature restoration law, the weakening of the ICE ban, that's the internal, the end of the production of petrol and diesel vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. That has been weakened. We've seen the corporate social responsibility legislation being weakened. What does that actually mean? Well, it means people not burning to death in sweatshops in Bangladesh. It means supply chains where we actually feel confident that the clothes we're wearing have been produced in socially just conditions. So we're seeing a huge amount of weakening, ostensibly in the name of simplification. But I actually think there is a real worry that if this continues, it will really reduce what we put in place over the last 5 years. So I am concerned. Forestry regulation as well, and I think we really have to make it very clear to the European People's Party that they cannot simply weaken the legislation that we put in place.
Okay, Lisa, wrap up.
But I think they can't they? Because they're in the majority, and the opposition Renew are weakened. The Greens are weakened, and the hard right has been strengthened. And just to the point of a conversation earlier, I think one of the worries for Europe as a whole is the balkanisation of politics. In the UK, you have seen the fragmentation further of the left, with a possibility of Jeremy Corbyn setting up another party, possibly Reform taking over from the Tories. And I wonder whether we look at a Europe in 10 years' time where you don't have those two central parties, centre-left, centre-right, ruling.
And just to add to that, Shona, it is not only the damage to environmental legislation, it is the working with the far right on political compromises. So the firewall, as it's called in Europe, is being broken, and that is, I think, quite disturbing for democracy and rule of law in the coming years.
There was a lot of hostility towards Ursula von der Leyen in that motion of censure in the European Parliament, and it was coming from her own sort of constituents.
Well, yeah, I think we have to remember everybody across Europe had their chance to vote last year in the European elections, and the Greens and the Liberals were the big losers, and the far right were the big winners. So we have to ask ourselves, why are people doing that? It's because they feel that the centrist, pro-European parties are losing touch with what matters to them on a day-to-day basis, right? Okay. So, that's why, they felt that the Green Deal was a top-down, imposed upon them. The EU needs to get back to basics. It needs to get back to the single market. It needs to get back at a national level. They need to get back to delivering services for local people. In Ireland, they have to do something about housing. If we don't sort housing, they won't just go to Sinn Féin, they'll go past Sinn Féin to whatever are on the margins on the left and right, and that will be truly scary.
Bill, final word to you on the Europe in a fractured world order.
Well, my final words would be, one, Europe should not flagellate itself about its position in this world, but it should regret that its economy has been weak for the last several years, and it's been weak for the reasons that Eoin said, which is that Germany has been weak. The big hope for Europe must be that the German economy revives and becomes again the locomotive economy for Europe. The fact that Germany is the one with the capacity to expand its economy using public spending. It has the lowest, among the lowest debts. It's now put this big public investment plan on the table. The key task for Europe is to make that into something that actually spends money productively and shares some of the benefit across the whole of Europe through imports rather than something that gets wasted. But it is a hope for Europe, and we should be positive about Europe's position.
Bill Emmott, Eoin, Drea, Lisa O'Carroll and Ciarán Cuffe, thank you very much.